proliferation of the resilient concept. I certainly, since I've been at ACDI from the beginning of last year, every proposal that I've had to look at has had resilience as a central concept in that proposal. And my good colleagues at CST, I said to them, we've got to do something around resilience.
Resilience is a term that's increasingly being used, and we're seeing it used in so many different ways, both from an academic perspective and from a practice perspective. And it means different things to different people, but it's got widespread appeal, which is why it's being used so widely. But what we need to do is understand how people are using it and what they mean by it, so we don't get confused and create more tension.
Yes, I think the measurement of resilience is quite problematic because resilience in itself is a complex term, and it is an outcome, it is not an output. Therefore, it's very difficult to measure that as an output. It's almost equating it to trying to measure love. How do you measure love? Immediately you would ask the question, for whom? My love for my wife, for my children, for my neighbor. It varies. It varies within context and it varies within time and space. So I'm not very happy with the fact that everyone tries to develop one kind of measuring stick and saying, well, this is what resilience is. I think resilience must be understood within the context of which we are focusing on.
Well, one of the big things that we look at for SDI when it comes to, especially when it comes to urbanization, is that the rapid urbanization of cities across the world is basically meaning that there's going to be a massive focus in terms of informality and the growth of informality across the globe. And with climate change and all of the problems that it brings, some of the biggest impacts are going to be in those cities where we have major areas of slum areas, informal settlements. And so in our space, this idea of working with resilience and trying to understand how to make communities more resilient is very important, because the battleground for where all these big impacts are going to be and where the hardest impacts are going to be are in the very areas where we focus, the informal settlements, the slums across the world.
Some of the original definitions have really been about this resilience as a system property that you can maybe measure, and that I think especially goes back to some of the original Holling definitions in the 1970s and some of the work that's kind of built on that. Then there's a lot of people, and I think even quite a lot of the work at the Stockholm Resilience Center, where I used to be based, is actually thinking of resilience kind of more as a broad approach and framework for investigating systems. And so it's not specifically looking at tipping points. So, I mean, some people, they don't even really believe so much in tipping points. So there's also quite a mix there. And then I think in terms of a lot of the kind of practical application, people are actually thinking of resilience as an outcome or a goal. And that's a very normative kind of framing of resilience. And there's really, I find, a very big mix with people using these three different ways of thinking about resilience, and often in the same paper.
I understand that resilience is the capacity of a system, like an adolescent, to adjust well to any stressor which is so significant or so severe that it has the potential to disrupt or to change how that system is functioning or developing. And I've highlighted the two key issues. In the field of psychology, we cannot talk about resilience if there isn't a significant disturbance, some significant form of threat. You can talk then about any of the other positive psychology constructs like coping, and we won't go into those today. So there has to be significant adversity, and in the presence of that significant adversity, there must be some form of successful adaptation.
What we've also come to observe is that at a number of the major banks in Canada and the United Kingdom, France, as well as some of the larger social media companies, Google and Facebook, they've come to name their in-house cyber security units as their resilience units, which is an interesting framing from their side, that they they're using the word resilience as a way of understanding the types of preparedness that's necessary and the response actions that they might be taking.
In the resilience domain, and in cities, there's this move from withstanding or responding to shocks to recovering to looking at transformative change. And I think it's important to understand which part of those you're looking at, because it has very different implications. And it has different implications as well for governance.
It's been argued, and I think from quite a lot of scholars, that, and I think this is also where there's quite a lot of interest in this term, is this feeling that there's the potential of this concept to help reframe our thinking and planning, especially to be better able to deal with change, uncertainty, unknowability, and normativity. And I think a lot of the way that we've been approaching science before is actually trying to figure out how things work and then plan around that. And this is actually a different way of thinking, is how do we have capacity to deal with things that we can't figure out and can't predict that are going to happen.
The definition that we work with is resilience is the ability of individuals, communities, businesses, organizations, systems to survive, adapt, and thrive no matter what chronic stress or acute shock they face. And when I talk about that definition, there's two particular things that are important there for me. The one is that it's not about just the city government. I think a lot of strategies that are written by governments focus on what we can do as a government, but this is about what all actors operating in the city can do to build resilience. And so that's been central for us in the development process. And the other is that resilience for us is not just about shocks. Shocks are important, but we need to look at the stresses that undermine us when shocks hit. And if we can do that, then we will truly build resilience. And so that's why it is different to disaster risk management, because it's not just focused on the disaster.
We as human beings have the ability to change, I'm going to call it the systems which we interact with, the systems that we have, and the systems on which we depend. And if we are able to identify these areas, these problems, these shocks, these stresses, these hazards that we sit with, there's many things we can do as humans. Maybe not necessarily manage the cyclone or the hurricane that we find ourselves in, but there's a lot we can do to mitigate and to prevent the possible impact of this on human lives and on human livelihood.
The resilience of African adolescents is about more than the African adolescent. The African adolescent is important, but the social ecology around the African adolescent, the family, the organizations, the community, the built environment, the natural environment, and how that ecology around the adolescent facilitates or co-facilitates resilience is actually probably the most important part of African adolescent resilience.
In summary, resilience, I think, potentially offers a way to reframe our thinking and planning, and it's especially associated with some of the current challenges the Anthropocene poses. And I think some of the potential it offers is really through building on insights from complexity theory. And at the moment, the socio-ecological systems field seems quite a hotspot of where a lot of this work is happening. I think this is really important to emphasize, because I also see people are using all kinds of definitions, but there's really been substantial conceptual progression, I think, within the field. And one can't just sort of use Holling 1973, because things have actually moved on from there. And I think that's actually really important to keep in mind when you're reading some of these classic authors. And then I also think there is important that there are some emerging commonalities, and especially around the recognition of these normative and ethical dimensions of thinking about resilience, and the need for participatory engagement.
So what is economic resilience, and how does this differ from the concept of normal resilience? A resilient economy, as we've defined it within DDAT, is defined as one that is able to recover rapidly from the effects of adverse shocks or withstand shocks. And this looks at examples such as the collapse of a property or stock market bubble, the impacts of an unexpected natural disaster, such as our recent drought, and those kind of factors too. And it sort of starts at one point and goes through a sort of cyclic process towards the end, noting the interrelations and interdependencies and feedback loops between each of those points. And in many cases, resilience is about the ability of a system to transform, which we've spoken about at length today as well, and not trying to return to the status quo, but rather becoming more adaptive and a sustainable system.
We think there's a lot of excitement around the fact that small firms actually seem to be much more resilient than large firms, and that our emerging economic context then seems to be preparing our firms to be more resilient than other contexts. Some of the recommendations we came up with was that firms should develop disruption orientation, be more proactive, and that large firms can learn a lot about becoming resilient from small firms. And one of the things that really came out for us was that having the resources is not enough. You actually need the capabilities to understand how to use the resources and reconfigure them. And that actually the firms that are the most successful and the most resilient are those that are experimenting. You know, the entrepreneur that's constantly tinkering to try and improve things and that's resource constrained. These are the firms that are coming out as being the most resilient.
I think the one thing that we found in our work is that when it comes to resilience and climate change and all sorts of other funding, is that it's normally directed towards national or central government. And the problem with that is that it doesn't find itself where it's actually required for implementation, for change to really be felt, which is at the local space. So if there was to be a change in terms of the provision of funding going directly to cities or municipalities, that would make a really big impact on the ground, because it would be responsive to what exactly should be happening in terms of transforming how urban spaces are and helping them to become more resilient.
There were 3 key supports, key resources, key provisions that made a significant difference to the mental health and school progression of adolescents in the Eastern Cape. And they were when they had parents who were supportive, when they attended schools that were safe. So the schools were pretty much free of violence, and when their family had a cash transfer. Look how far it's gone from the dopamine or the individual's capacity to do well in the face of threats.
Everybody feels they need more resilience, even the people who are sitting in here, exactly. And so at what cost is that? And so one of my colleagues, Lorenzo Cileri, has talked about trade-offs in resilience, and I really think it's such an important concept, because we do have to acknowledge that. And who wants to give away power? It comes back to the questions of power. Nobody wants to give away power, but we've got to start shifting it. So how do we engage in those difficult conversations?